The cruelest part about losing someone is realizing who only loved you when they were standing beside you. The first time my son walked past me without really seeing me, I was standing in my own kitchen holding a plate of blueberry pancakes that were already getting cold. It was a quiet Sunday morning in late October, the kind Boston does so well. Gray skies pressed low over the rooftops, rain tapping softly against the windows while the smell of coffee drifted through the house. Ethan came downstairs wearing a dark sweatshirt and carrying his phone in one hand, barely glancing in my direction as he headed toward the front door. "Morning," I said gently, forcing warmth into my voice the same way mothers do even when something feels wrong. He stopped for barely half a second. "Morning, Mom." Then he kept walking. No smile. No pause. No "how did you sleep?" Nothing. The front door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than it should have in a house this quiet. I stood there for a moment staring at the untouched pancakes in my hands while rain slid slowly down the kitchen windows. It sounds small when I say it out loud now. Ridiculous even. A grown son distracted on a Sunday morning. People would probably tell me I was overthinking it. But mothers notice the exact moment love starts changing shape inside their children. We feel it before anyone says anything out loud. I carried the plate back to the stove and turned off the burner beneath the second batch I had been making for Ethan and his wife, Claire. Years ago, Sunday mornings used to feel alive in this house. Ethan would come downstairs still half asleep asking if there was extra bacon. Music would play softly from the living room while football games hummed in the background all afternoon. After my husband Walter passed away 3 years earlier, I held on to those routines desperately, because routines were the only thing keeping the silence from swallowing me whole. At first, Ethan understood that. He came by often. He checked on me after work. He fixed little things around the house Walter used to handle himself. But after Claire entered the picture, something shifted slowly. Inside him. Not immediately. Claire was charming when we first met. Beautiful in a polished, effortless way that made people pay attention without realizing they were doing it. She brought expensive wine to dinner, complimented my cooking, hugged me tightly when she arrived. Everyone loved her instantly, including me. That was probably my first mistake. I believed kindness was always sincere simply because I offered mine sincerely. I walked slowly into the dining room, carrying my coffee mug while the grandfather clock ticked softly beside the staircase. The house looked beautiful that morning despite the weather outside. Warm cream walls, dark hardwood floors. Walter installed himself nearly 20 years ago. Framed family photographs lining the hallway leading toward the living room. Ethan at age 6 wearing a Red Sox cap too big for his head. Ethan at his college graduation with his arm around me proudly. Ethan smiling beside Claire on their wedding day beneath strings of golden lights in Cape Cod. Looking at those photographs hurt differently now because I could see exactly when his eyes stopped turning toward me first. Claire came downstairs about 20 minutes later dressed perfectly despite the early hour, wearing cream-colored lounge clothes and carrying a stainless steel water bottle that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "Good morning, Margaret," she said brightly while opening the refrigerator. "Ethan already left?" "He said he needed to run errands," I answered softly. Claire nodded casually, though something about her expression felt rehearsed. "He mentioned wanting some space lately. Work has been stressful." Space. Strange word for a son who lived 15 minutes away from his widowed mother, yet somehow seemed farther from me every month. I sat quietly at the dining table, stirring cream into my coffee, while Claire scrolled through her phone. The silence between us stretched awkwardly despite her perfectly polished smile. "You should think about downsizing eventually," she said suddenly without looking up from the screen. My hand stopped moving against the coffee cup. "Excuse me." Claire finally glanced toward me, still smiling. "This house is huge for one person. Ethan worries about you managing it alone." There it was. Soft enough to sound caring. Sharp enough to leave a mark. I looked around the dining room slowly. Walter's favorite painting still hung beside the fireplace exactly where he left it. The antique china cabinet passed down from my mother reflected pale morning light across the walls. Every inch of this house carried memories stitched carefully into it. "I managed just fine," I replied quietly. Claire gave a tiny shrug before returning her attention to her phone. "Of course. I just think Ethan feels responsible now." Responsible. Funny how quickly love starts sounding like obligation once the wrong person begins translating it for someone else. Rain continued falling steadily outside while the silence inside the house settled heavier around me. Claire eventually left for brunch with friends, kissing my cheek politely before heading out the door. The second she disappeared, the warmth left the room entirely. I stood alone in the kitchen afterwards, staring at the cold pancakes still sitting untouched on the stove. And for the first time since Walter died, I felt something deeper than loneliness settle quietly into my chest. I felt replaced. The morning after felt heavier than I had imagined it could. Sunlight poured weakly through the blinds in my small Boston kitchen, but it did little to brighten the weight pressing down on my chest. I poured a second cup of coffee, my hands shaking slightly as I watched the dark liquid swirl, remembering the coldness in Ethan's eyes just yesterday. He had always been warm in the mornings, talking about his plans, asking if I needed anything, sharing small jokes that made me laugh despite the quiet sadness of our home without Walter. But now there was distance, subtle but palpable, an invisible line that had grown steadily since Claire moved in. I walked toward the living room, running a hand along the back of the sofa, remembering every afternoon Ethan had spent there with his father, learning to play chess, laughing at silly movies, doing homework on the coffee table with the soft hum of the old Boston skyline outside the window. The walls seemed to echo those memories, each picture frame reflecting moments that now felt fragile, like glass threatening to shatter with the slightest pressure. I noticed the small details I had always loved. The way the sunlight touched the corner of the room in the morning, the soft hum of the radiator in the colder months, the faint aroma of baked bread lingering from the evening before. Each of these became anchors for my thoughts, a way to ground myself in the familiarity that Claire could never replicate. I decided to tidy up the room, arranging magazines and straightening cushions, trying to fill the space with something tangible while I felt the growing gap between myself and my son. When Ethan finally returned that afternoon, he moved through the house quietly, as if testing the air, his eyes rarely meeting mine. He placed his backpack on the counter and muttered a brief, distracted greeting. I smiled, hiding the ache, and asked about his day, but his response was minimal, polite, distant, and it was clear that the energy in the room had shifted entirely. I guided him toward the kitchen table, insisting we talk while preparing a simple meal together, hoping the act of shared space could bring a semblance of normalcy. The conversation began with mundane topics, work schedules, errands, minor chores, but underneath lay a tension that neither of us addressed directly. I felt the urge to ask him about Claire, about his changing demeanor, but the words caught in my throat. There was a fear in pressing too hard, of pushing him further away, and so I focused on what I could control, the warmth of the room, the food on the table, the gentle reassurances that life still carried routines even amidst personal shifts. As the afternoon waned into early evening, we moved to the living room, sipping tea, the glow of the lamps casting a soft light across the photographs on the wall. I noticed Ethan glance at a picture of Walter and him fishing on the Charles River, his lips pressing together in a momentary smile before he looked away. That fleeting connection gave me hope that the bond we had nurtured over decades had not been entirely lost, that beneath the layers of new relationships and shifting priorities, the core of our family remained. I let the silence stretch comfortably between us, appreciating the simple presence of my son nearby, even as I sensed the subtle pull of outside influences reshaping the dynamics of our household. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and the lingering aroma of coffee, a comfort in itself, and as I watched Ethan prepare to leave for an evening commitment, I felt a quiet determination to remain steadfast, to hold space for our relationship in ways that were patient and gentle, understanding that love sometimes required waiting, endurance, and silent reassurance more than immediate expressions. The evening closed in slowly, the Boston skyline darkening outside the window, and I sat alone once more, reflecting on the importance of presence, patience, and the small acts of care that could keep our family thread intact despite new challenges. The soft ticking of the clock became a metronome to my thoughts, and I resolved to continue creating moments of connection, no matter how subtle, trusting that the love between a mother and her child could withstand temporary distance and shifting dynamics. 3 days later, the first real cold front of November rolled through Boston, coating the streets with damp gray fog and carrying the sharp scent of rain through the city. I woke before sunrise like I always did, wrapped myself in Walter's old navy cardigan, and stood by the kitchen window watching headlights blur across the wet pavement outside. The house felt too quiet again. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of every clock ticking and every floorboard settling beneath your feet. I brewed coffee slowly while the old radio near the refrigerator played soft jazz low enough to barely fill the room. Walter used to hum along to those songs while reading the newspaper every morning. Sometimes I still caught myself setting out 2 mugs instead of 1. Grief changes shape over time, but it never really leaves a house completely. Around 8 o'clock, Ethan arrived unexpectedly. I heard his key turn in the front door before his footsteps crossed the hallway toward the kitchen. He looked exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes, tension sitting heavily in his shoulders. "You are up early," I said gently while pouring him coffee without asking if he wanted any. He gave a tired smile and sat down at the kitchen island. Could not sleep. Rain tapped softly against the windows while steam rose between us from our coffee cups. For a moment, the scene almost felt normal again. Familiar. Like the mornings after Walter died when Ethan used to stop by before work just to make sure I was eating properly and not sitting alone too long. "How is Claire?" I asked carefully. Ethan stared down into his coffee before answering. "Busy." One word. Flat. Empty. I noticed how quickly conversations about his wife now ended before they truly began. "You two okay?" I asked softly. He exhaled slowly through his nose and rubbed one hand across his jaw. "Yeah, just stressed lately." Stress. Another word people use when the real explanation feels too complicated to admit aloud. I nodded quietly and let the silence settle instead of forcing conversation. That was something motherhood taught me over the years. Silence often reveals more than questions do. Ethan eventually glanced toward the dining room, where framed family photographs lined the wall beside the staircase. His eyes lingered briefly on one picture in particular. Walter teaching him how to carve a Thanksgiving turkey when Ethan was 16. Both of them laughing while flour covered the kitchen counter behind them. "I miss him," Ethan said suddenly, his voice quieter than before. My chest tightened gently at the honesty in those words. "I know." He stared toward the photograph a little longer before speaking again. "Claire says I spend too much time here sometimes." There it was, softly spoken, almost casually, but the words landed hard anyway. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug carefully, grounding myself before responding. "And what do you think?" Ethan looked uncomfortable immediately. "She just worries about boundaries." Boundaries. Such a cold modern word for family sometimes. Walter used to say families survived because people showed up for each other without measuring emotional square footage. I looked around the kitchen slowly. The same pale yellow walls Walter painted himself 15 years ago. The same wooden table where Ethan used to do homework while I cooked spaghetti on school nights. The same house that carried decades of ordinary love stitched quietly into every room. "This house was never a place you had to schedule yourself into," I said softly. Ethan lowered his eyes after that. Guilt moved across his face quickly before disappearing again behind exhaustion. I hated seeing him like this, torn between loyalty and influence. Before either of us could continue, the front door opened again. Claire. She entered carrying shopping bags and wearing a long camel-colored coat, her expression brightening instantly when she spotted Ethan. "There you are," she said warmly before kissing his cheek. Then her eyes shifted toward me. "Good morning, Margaret." "Morning," I replied quietly. Claire set her bags down on the counter and glanced between us carefully, instantly reading the emotional atmosphere in the room the way skilled people do. "Everything okay?" she asked lightly. Ethan straightened slightly on the stool beside me. "We were just talking." Claire smiled, though it looked tighter than usual around the edges. "About Dad," Ethan answered before I could speak. Something flickered briefly across Claire's expression, then disappeared almost instantly. Not irritation exactly. Discomfort perhaps. Walter's memory had become inconvenient for her over time because memories reminded Ethan who he used to be before every part of his life became carefully managed. Claire moved around the kitchen, opening cabinets and reorganizing things that did not need reorganizing while she spoke casually about errands and appointments. But even ordinary conversation with her carried subtle pressure underneath it. "I was actually telling Ethan we should start focusing more on our future plans," she said while adjusting glasses inside the cabinet. At some point, people have to stop living in the past. My eyes lifted slowly toward her. The kitchen suddenly felt colder despite the warmth from the heater beneath the window. Ethan noticed it too. "Claire," he said quietly, warning hidden beneath the softness. But she continued anyway, smiling faintly as if nothing unusual had been said. "I just think emotional attachment can make people hold on to things longer than they should. Things. Not memories. Not family. Things." I watched Ethan carefully then, waiting, hoping perhaps for the version of my son who once defended me instinctively, without hesitation. Instead, he stayed silent. And somehow that hurt more than Claire's words ever could. The afternoon sunlight streamed weakly through the Boston apartment windows, casting long shadows across the living room where Margaret sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly together. Ethan lingered near the doorway, awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other, a stack of unopened mail resting on the console table behind him. The air was filled with the quiet hum of the radiator and the occasional distant sound of traffic from the street below, but inside, a heavier silence dominated, punctuated only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Margaret looked up, catching Ethan's eyes briefly before returning to her hands. "I don't understand why she's so adamant about the schedule," she said softly, almost to herself. Ethan took a slow step closer, careful not to seem intrusive. "She just wants structure," he replied, his tone measured, keeping the conversation safe, neutral. Margaret exhaled slowly, feeling the tight knot of frustration loosen slightly, though the unease remained. She glanced around the room, noticing the small details that always reminded her of Walter, his favorite mug on the shelf, the worn book lying open on the coffee table, a scarf draped over the arm of the sofa. Memories of simpler days, family dinners, and Saturday mornings filled with laughter, pressed against her chest with gentle insistence. Ethan pulled up a chair, placing it across from her, and sat down, his hands folded on his knees. He avoided looking directly at Margaret, instead focusing on the pattern of the carpet, as if finding comfort in the ordinary while navigating the tension between past and present. "I tried calling Claire," he began carefully, but she didn't answer. "I left a message." Margaret nodded, listening without interrupting. "She's probably busy," she said, voice calm, though internally the worry gnawed at her. "It's just, I feel like I'm losing more than time with Ethan," she admitted. "I feel like I'm losing part of the connection I had with him when he was younger." Ethan's gaze lifted, meeting hers finally, understanding and empathy flickering across his face. "I know, Mom. I don't want that either. But she has her own way of thinking." Margaret sighed, shifting slightly on the sofa, feeling the weight of years of family bonds balanced delicately against the new dynamics of marriage and household boundaries. She wanted to assert herself, to protect the closeness she had nurtured for decades, yet she knew the conversation had to be gentle, measured, for Ethan's sake. They both sat in silence for a moment, the kind of quiet that carries reflection and unspoken thoughts. Ethan leaned back slightly, glancing at the window, noticing the clouds gathering for the late afternoon storm. The sky darkened, and the room took on a warmer, amber hue as the lights inside cast a cozy glow over the furniture and scattered belongings. "I remember when we used to bake together on weekends," Margaret said, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "It was chaotic, but those mornings were ours." Ethan's lips curved, small but genuine, as he recalled the moments of laughter, spilled flour, and hurried attempts to make perfect cookies that rarely turned out that way. "I miss that too," he said quietly, "more than I realized." The tension between them eased slightly as shared memories created a bridge over the gap that had grown subtly over time. Margaret reached over, adjusting the throw pillow beside her, the act grounding her in the present while her mind wandered through the past. Ethan watched her, noting the combination of strength and vulnerability that had always defined his mother. "Maybe we can start again," he suggested gently. "Just a few hours here or there, like before." Margaret nodded, feeling a tentative hope warming her chest. It was a fragile promise, but it held potential. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rustling the trees and sending a chill through the Boston streets. But inside, the room held warmth, light, and the quiet reassurance of family connections waiting to be nurtured once more. They spoke softly about small plans, about shared routines and subtle compromises, each word reinforcing the bond that weathered time, changes, and the shifting landscapes of relationships. The conversation stretched on as the day faded, shadows lengthening and intermingling with the golden light inside. In that space, with the soft hum of the city beyond and the intimate warmth of their apartment around them, Margaret and Ethan discovered a rhythm again, one that allowed for memory, for care, and for hope, gentle enough to encourage connection without eroding boundaries, delicate enough to sustain trust, and firm enough to remind both of them that the heart of a family beats strongest when it is nurtured thoughtfully and lovingly, step by step, day by day, moment by moment, in the quiet and ordinary spaces that form the backbone of life and love. The morning sunlight spilled gently into the Boston apartment, catching dust motes that danced lazily in the warmth of the living room. Margaret sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands cradling a mug of steaming tea, feeling the warmth seep into her palms while her gaze lingered on the framed family photos lining the mantel. Each photograph told a story she treasured, snapshots of birthdays, vacations, and everyday moments where laughter was the soundtrack of their lives. Ethan stood nearby at the kitchen island, sifting through a stack of papers with furrowed brows, his movements careful and deliberate, aware of the quiet weight in the room. "Mom," he began, his voice gentle yet firm. "I think we need to talk about the schedule for visits with Claire." Margaret lifted her eyes from the photos, catching his expression, a mixture of concern and responsibility, and nodded slowly. "I know, Ethan. I feel like I'm losing my place in your life. Not just the time, but the moments we share." Her words were soft, reflective, filled with the vulnerability of a mother who had always been the anchor in her son's life. Ethan set the papers down and leaned slightly on the island, offering a reassuring presence without intruding. "It's not that, Mom. She just has a different approach to the schedule, and I need to respect that too." Margaret took a deep breath, letting the tension loosen slightly, though a subtle ache remained in her chest. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant sound of traffic on the streets below. Sunlight reflected off the wooden floor, casting a warm glow over the room and highlighting the familiar details that held the history of their family. The well-worn sofa cushions, the rug that had seen countless footsteps, and the small ornaments scattered on the shelves. Ethan finally moved closer, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. "I don't want you to feel replaced or forgotten," he said, his tone measured, carrying both empathy and a desire to bridge the growing gap. Margaret's eyes softened, memories of shared breakfasts, homework sessions, and bedtime stories flooding her mind. "I know, Ethan. I just need to feel connected. I need those moments to matter." They shared a quiet silence, the kind that was heavy with unspoken emotions, yet comforting in its presence. Outside, the winter wind stirred the trees, sending a gentle rustle through the neighborhood, but inside, the room remained a sanctuary of warmth and shared understanding. Ethan offered a small smile, a gesture of reassurance, as he suggested, "Maybe we can plan our own little mornings together, just a few hours where it's just us, like old times." Margaret's lips curved in a tentative smile, the thought of renewed connection lighting a spark of hope within her. She reached for her mug, feeling the heat anchor her to the present while her mind traced the comforting path of past routines and cherished habits. "I would like that," she admitted softly, the words carrying the weight of longing and the promise of rebuilding what had been strained by circumstances beyond their control. They began discussing simple plans, weekend breakfasts, a walk through the neighborhood park, quiet afternoons with books and tea, each suggestion a gentle reaffirmation of the bond that had weathered years of change, distance, and growing responsibilities. As the morning light shifted, painting the room with soft golden tones, the mother and son sat closer together, their conversation flowing naturally, filled with careful compromises and mutual respect. Margaret felt a quiet relief wash over her, a sense that, despite the challenges and the new dynamics that had crept into their lives, there was still space for connection, trust, and shared moments. The day outside continued its rhythm, but within the Boston apartment, warmth, conversation, and the soft cadence of familial love created a haven, a space where the heart of their relationship could grow steadily, moment by moment, conversation by conversation, gently rebuilding the intimacy that had always defined their bond, with patience, understanding, and the enduring presence of one another. By the middle of November, the air in Boston carried that sharp cold that settles deep into your bones long before winter officially arrives. The trees outside my apartment building stood nearly bare now, thin branches swaying against pale gray skies, while people hurried down the sidewalks wrapped tightly in scarves and heavy coats. Inside the apartment, however, everything remained warm and familiar. I kept the same routines Walter and I built over decades, because routines gave shape to loneliness. Every morning, I watered the small plants near the kitchen window. Every afternoon, I folded blankets carefully over the living room sofa. Every evening, I lit the small vanilla candle Ethan bought me during a trip to Vermont years earlier. Tiny habits, tiny comforts. Sometimes survival looks very ordinary from the outside. That Thursday afternoon, I stood in the kitchen rolling pie dough across the counter while soft Frank Sinatra music played from the speaker near the dining room. Thanksgiving was only a week away, and despite everything that had changed lately, I still planned to cook the same meal I had prepared every year since Ethan was a little boy. Turkey with rosemary butter, sweet potatoes with cinnamon, homemade cranberry sauce. Walter used to joke that my stuffing alone could solve family arguments. I smiled faintly, remembering that while flour dusted my fingertips. Around 3 o'clock, my phone buzzed softly against the counter. "Ethan." "Hey, Mom," he said when I answered. His voice sounded distracted again, tired beneath the surface. "Hi, sweetheart." I leaned against the kitchen island, already sensing something heavy inside the silence between his breaths. "Claire and I were talking about Thanksgiving." There it was. That careful tone people use when they already know the conversation will hurt you before it even begins. I kept my voice steady. "Okay." Ethan hesitated. "Claire thinks it might be easier if we host this year instead." Easier. Another harmless-sounding word that somehow always arrived carrying disappointment behind it. I looked around my kitchen slowly while rain tapped lightly against the windows again. Every Thanksgiving memory Ethan had ever known lived inside these walls. The measuring marks scratched into the cabinet door from childhood growth spurts. The dining table Walter built by hand during our 15th year of marriage. The corner near the stove where Ethan used to sneak pieces of pie crust before dinner. "I see," I answered quietly. Ethan exhaled slowly. "She thinks it would be less stressful for everyone." Less stressful for everyone. I noticed how often Claire framed her preferences as universal needs rather than personal desires. It was subtle, elegant even. But once you recognized the pattern, you could not stop seeing it. "Does that include me?" I asked softly before I could stop myself. Silence. Long enough to hurt. "Mom." Ethan sounded exhausted now. "That is not what I meant." But it was exactly what he meant whether he realized it or not. I rested one hand against the counter, grounding myself before speaking again. "Your father loved Thanksgiving in this house." Ethan grew quiet immediately at the mention of Walter. "I know. You loved it too." Another silence. "I still do." I closed my eyes briefly, listening to the soft music drifting through the apartment while the scent of cinnamon and butter filled the kitchen around me. The ache inside my chest was not anger. Anger burns hot and fast. This felt colder, slower. Like watching someone gradually pack away pieces of your life while insisting they were helping you organize. Claire already invited her family, did she not? I asked gently. Ethan hesitated again. That was answer enough. "Mom, I was going to tell you." I almost laughed softly at that. Not because it was funny, because betrayal always sounds so small when spoken aloud plainly. "Of course you were," I answered quietly. We spoke a few minutes longer after that about meaningless details neither of us truly cared about. Grocery lists, parking downtown, whether snow was expected next week. Conversations people use to avoid standing too close to emotional truth. After we hung up, the apartment became painfully quiet again. Sinatra continued singing softly from the speaker while rain blurred the city skyline outside my kitchen windows. I stared down at the unfinished pie dough beneath my hands for a very long time. Then slowly, carefully, I wrapped it in plastic and placed it inside the refrigerator anyway. Because some habits are tied to hope, whether hope deserves them or not. Around 6 o'clock that evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it expecting perhaps a neighbor or delivery driver. Instead, Claire stood there wearing a long ivory coat and carrying a shopping bag in one hand. Her smile appeared immediately when she saw me. Perfect. Controlled. I thought I would stop by, she said warmly while stepping inside. The apartment suddenly felt smaller around her somehow. Claire glanced toward the kitchen and noticed the baking ingredients still spread across the counter. Flour, cinnamon, pie tins. Her smile tightened almost invisibly for half a second. You were already preparing for Thanksgiving? She asked lightly. I nodded once. I always start early. Claire placed her purse carefully beside the sofa before turning back toward me. Margaret, she began gently. I hope you understand Ethan and I are just trying to create our own traditions now. There it was again. That soft, polished voice rapping sharp truths inside kindness delicate enough to avoid criticism. I looked directly at her beneath the warm kitchen light. And where exactly do you think his old traditions are supposed to go? For the first time since meeting her, Claire did not answer immediately. The late November wind rattled the Boston window panes as I sat quietly in the living room. The scent of cinnamon and pine lingering from the small holiday decorations I had insisted on keeping up even as the apartment felt emptier than usual. Ethan was in the corner of the room, sorting through a stack of mail with careful movements, each envelope a small testament to responsibilities and distant connections, yet his expression was distant, thoughts elsewhere. I took a slow sip of tea, the warmth spreading through my hands, and watched him for a moment longer than I should have, letting the quiet stretch between us, heavy and charged with unspoken words. The phone call from earlier still lingered in my mind, Claire's polite insistence weaving its way into our home, creating subtle ripples across the familiar spaces where laughter and small disputes once lived comfortably. Ethan, I said softly, breaking the silence without looking directly at him. Have you considered helping with the preparations this weekend? His head lifted, eyes meeting mine briefly, acknowledging the question, yet I could see the hesitation, the internal balancing act of familial obligation and new attachments. He nodded slowly, setting the papers aside and rising to help, moving toward the kitchen with the habitual ease that only familiarity brings. I followed a few steps behind, carrying a folded tablecloth and a small basket of utensils, positioning them neatly on the dining table, a ritual of order amidst the uncertainty that had crept into our lives. Claire had suggested changes, small ones at first, adjustments to seating arrangements and decorations, but each suggestion carried the weight of a subtle redefinition, the gentle reshaping of spaces that had been claimed by decades of tradition. Ethan adjusted the chairs as I placed the silverware, the click of metal against wood punctuating the rhythm of our movements. Mom, do you think Dad would have minded? He asked softly, breaking the calm with a question that reached deeper than the surface of daily tasks. I paused, considering the right words, balancing honesty with comfort. He would have minded the change, yes, I admitted gently, but he would have loved seeing you take care of these traditions. Ethan's eyes softened, a mixture of guilt and understanding passing over his features. He moved to the counter to begin arranging serving dishes while I handled the finer details, placing napkins in precise folds and arranging candles to catch the early evening light. The apartment felt alive with anticipation despite the tension. The soft hum of the city outside was a distant backdrop to the intimate choreography inside. Conversation trickled in gently between us, observations about the weather, the neighborhood, and the mundane exchanges that served as bridges over the chasms of emotion that had grown in recent weeks. We shared moments of quiet laughter, fleeting and delicate, a reminder of the bond that persisted despite external influences. As the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the hardwood floors, I caught glimpses of Ethan's reflection in the window, contemplative and earnest, and I wondered if he realized how these small actions anchored both of us in the shared past, even as the present pulled at new directions. Claire's influence, her careful positioning within Ethan's life, was a subtle current, shaping choices and priorities without overt confrontation, yet the effects were palpable, a gentle reorientation that shifted the dynamics of our home. I leaned back slightly, allowing a deep breath to settle, savoring the calm before the evening's bustle would begin. The soft ticking of the clock on the wall marked the passage of time, echoing the rhythm of our carefully maintained routines, the continuity of daily life providing structure amidst the uncertainties. Dinner preparations continued in unspoken synchrony. each movement a testament to the silent understanding that while changes came, certain elements remained, holding space for memories, for traditions, and for the connection between mother and son that had been cultivated over years of shared experience. In this quiet, measured choreography, I found a strange comfort, the certainty of small actions preserving the integrity of our home and our bond even as the world outside continued to shift and evolve, bringing new challenges and subtle tests to the resilience of family ties. The evening settled over the Boston apartment with a quiet familiarity that felt both comforting and heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the small tensions of the day, and I sat on the sofa, holding the soft fabric of a throw blanket, the warmth of the room contrasting with the crisp air pressing against the windows. Ethan moved carefully around the kitchen, arranging dishes and utensils with a precision that spoke to his attentiveness, each movement deliberate, yet his mind seemed distant, caught between the present tasks and the lingering echoes of conversations past. I watched him over the edge of the sofa, noticing the subtle shifts in his posture, the way he paused, perhaps recalling something said earlier, a phrase from Claire that had lingered longer than I had anticipated. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant city sounds created a rhythm for the evening, a backdrop that made the small domestic acts feel significant, and I found myself reflecting on the changing dynamics in our home, the adjustments we had all made to accommodate new routines and influences, each small act a negotiation between past familiarity and present necessity. The table was set, the silverware polished, and the gentle clinking of ceramic plates as Ethan carried them to the dining area punctuated the silent dialogue between us, the comfort of shared labor mingling with the unspoken questions about roles, responsibilities, and the subtle shifts in attention that had begun to surface. I poured a cup of tea for myself, inhaling the familiar aroma and letting it anchor me in the present, a small ritual amidst the larger currents of family life that seemed to push and pull with their own momentum. As he returned to the sofa, carrying a small tray, I noticed the slight furrow in his brow, a reflection of the thoughtful consideration that seemed to accompany each of his actions, and I realized that these moments, ordinary to an outsider, were rich with meaning, each choice and gesture a reflection of the ongoing negotiation of our relationships. We spoke in measured tones, discussing the upcoming weekend plans, the adjustments to daily schedules, and the nuances of holiday preparations that now carried an additional layer of complexity, influenced by external opinions and the subtle realignment of priorities. Our conversation was punctuated with pauses, spaces where neither of us needed to speak, where presence alone conveyed understanding and a shared history that neither words nor tasks could fully capture. As the evening deepened and the city lights shimmered through the windows, the apartment seemed to hold us in a delicate balance, the interplay of light and shadow reflecting the subtle emotional landscapes we navigated, and I felt a quiet sense of anticipation for the days ahead, the routines and rituals we maintained providing both structure and a measure of security. I glanced at Ethan, noting the attentive way he arranged the cushions and the soft glances he cast toward me, a silent acknowledgement of the bonds we shared and the new elements that had begun to influence our interactions. Each small movement, each carefully chosen word, seemed to carry weight, shaping the atmosphere of the home and the rhythm of our shared experiences. And in that moment, I appreciated the resilience of the connection we had cultivated over years of shared life, a connection that adapted yet endured, rooted in understanding, familiarity, and the quiet persistence of care. As the clock ticked softly and the room settled into a tranquil rhythm, I realized that while the dynamics of attention, priorities, and presence were shifting, the foundation of our relationship remained intact, a subtle reassurance that even in moments of change, the bond between mother and son continued to provide both comfort and guidance, a living testament to the enduring nature of familial connection, careful consideration, and the quiet strength found in shared spaces and mutual respect. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the Boston apartment windows, casting a warm golden glow over the living room, and I found myself seated quietly on the edge of the sofa, the soft fabric beneath my hands grounding me in the present moment while my thoughts swirled with a mixture of anticipation and reflection. Ethan, moving with a careful deliberation that had become familiar over the years, adjusted a cushion on the nearby armchair, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the framed photographs lining the mantel, each image a frozen memory, a silent testimony to the life we had built and the subtle shifts that now defined our days. The apartment smelled faintly of freshly brewed coffee, mingling with the soft scent of pine from the small holiday tree in the corner, a sensory reminder of routines and comforts that had always defined our home, and yet today carried the weight of unspoken considerations and evolving dynamics. I observed him arranging papers on the coffee table, noting the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful way he measured each movement, as though ensuring that nothing in our environment disrupted the fragile equilibrium we were both navigating. Our conversation began with small gestures, shared observations about the day, the neighborhood, and the quiet rhythms of life in Boston, but gradually unfolded into more personal territory, a careful probing into how our relationship had shifted, how priorities had realigned, and how our shared space now bore witness to subtle adjustments in attention and presence. He spoke softly, each word deliberate, reflective, and I felt the weight of the conversation as it moved between us, a delicate dance of acknowledgement, understanding, and the occasional pause where silence conveyed more than any phrase could capture. The city outside continued its steady pulse, a distant hum that seemed to contrast with the intimate stillness within the apartment, reminding me of the broader world in which our private lives were quietly unfolding, where interactions and relationships took shape against the backdrop of routine and unexpected developments alike. I sipped my tea, the warmth grounding me, and watched Ethan as he glanced up, our eyes meeting in a moment of shared comprehension, an unspoken recognition of the bonds that had weathered countless small tests and minor upheavals, each one layering depth onto the trust and familiarity that connected us. We spoke of plans for the week ahead, the subtle balancing of commitments and shared responsibilities, the small but significant acts of care and attention that kept our household running smoothly, while also nurturing the ongoing connection between us. And I realized that these interactions, mundane in appearance, carried profound significance in maintaining the cohesion and emotional resonance of our family life. The sunlight shifted, lengthening shadows across the hardwood floor, and I felt a quiet sense of resolution, an understanding that despite the evolving circumstances and occasional uncertainties, the foundation of our relationship remained steady, anchored in mutual respect, careful observation, and the persistent care we showed for one another in thought, word, and action. As the afternoon waned into evening, the room took on a gentle serenity, the interplay of light, space, and presence emphasizing the continuity of our bond, the subtle patterns of attention and support that defined our shared life, and I recognized in that quiet, reflective moment the enduring importance of connection, awareness, and the patient cultivation of understanding, all of which shaped the delicate balance of daily life and the meaningful exchanges that sustained us.